Thank you so much. Um, what I've decided to do is sort of pick up on where the rest of the panel has left off and just give a hint of the various other ethnic conflicts in Southeast Asia. Today, I'll be looking at Laos, Thailand, Philippines, and Indonesia. And essentially, I think there are 4 or 5 core aspects that seem to sort of transcend through the various conflicts in these particular countries. One, which is a common trend, is a history in colonization, which left a situation of countries having to fend for themselves post this colonization, and a sense of nationalism then coming through, which actually, instead of uniting the various peoples in these regions, actually ended up dividing them further. And one thing that we must remember when we talk about Southeast Asia is that it's a very, very culturally diverse region, especially within those countries. Whether you look at Myanmar or Indonesia, everywhere the problem is the same. So essentially, this idea of nationalism has never been so much as to integrate all of those peoples within the country, but to look at one or two majority peoples versus the rest. And this has been the underlying problem of all the current ethnic conflicts, as I will come to speak of. The third thing that is quite interesting to see, especially under the current circumstances, is an emergence of religious fundamentalism. Now, the problem with this is that, combined with issues of forced migration and refugees, this leaves us at a point of actually having to start talk about these ethnic conflicts much more than they are currently given a focus and scope on. So, just to sort of talk about the Laos issue specifically, I think it's primarily between the Lao People's Army and the members of the Hmong people. Now, this isn't so much an insurgency that has led to a wide, number of deaths, but the problem at hand is the fact that essentially the Hmong people were supposed to be allies of the French that were previously a part of the occupation in Laos, and then also of the US that further then came in during the Vietnam War. And because the Hmong people at that particular point actually were allies of these colonizing powers, they were actually treated rather badly once in 1975. The Vietnam War had come to an end, and the Americans had had lost their support in the region. So the Pathet Lao, which was the government at that time, actually, in a sense of retribution, committed genocide amongst the Hmong people, forcing them to flee to Thailand and to even the US, actually, some of them, and also into hiding. There were rapes as a method of actually impinging upon an idea of identity took place. And even till date, even though the Hmong people are considered to be a peaceful race, they still suffer a lot at the hands of the government that considers them as tyrants and rascals. So that's how the particular situation at Laos currently stands. Just to give you an idea of how many people got killed in this entire process, just a sort of idea, there were about 100,000 killed out of a population of 400,000 people. So, and even till date, up until 2003, when foreign journalists actually went into the hidings of the Hmong people, they actually mentioned how they lived in hunger, strife, and lack of access to basic sense of occupation, health, education. So and even despite this particular situation, they are not guaranteed basic acceptance into the Laos structure. So that's one of the impending, and just to sort of end this, even in 2009, 4,500 refugees were actually forcibly repatriated to Laos from camps in Thailand, despite the objections of the US and the United Nations. So this is really interesting. Throughout the history of ethnic conflicts in Southeast Asia, you will note a lot of migrations across countries, and then a lot of forced repatriations, and especially, as I mentioned, in today's circumstances, this is an issue that must be taken up very, very seriously. Moving on to Thailand, since 2004, the South Thailand insurgency is an ongoing conflict centered in southern Thailand. It originated in 1948, again historical roots as an ethnic and religious separatist insurgency in the historical Malay Patani region. Now, again, the number of people that have died and injured in the process is humongous, but I think the more interesting key aspect of this particular ethnic insurgency is the fact that it used to be a separatist insurgency, but has now taken over a hardline militant jihadism. And earlier, at least these separatist groups wanted to talk to the government and come to some form of peaceful communication. But this jihadist Salafi movement does not want to engage in talks with the government. In fact, it wants to do the exact reverse of that, which is to allow no form of governance to reach South Thailand and essentially then, sort of facilitate the process of independence. So this particular trend of Salafi jihadist terrorism is something that must be looked into rather keenly. Of course, there have been many studies that have suggested that this is not just a local movement, but has international connections to it. It is rather contentious, but given the current circumstances, one would not want to keep that out of the picture. Also, the other thing is that this particular conflict has no specific leaders per se. It has a vast connection, a vast leadership movement, and therefore the Thai government's process of actually engaging and bringing this particular movement to a close has been rather difficult and sloppy in some ways. So, in fact, they've actually found that the counter-insurgency movement in itself has been retrograde rather than, being positive in the process of the national reconciliation. Another interesting aspect of this would be, I don't know if some of you might have heard of this, but the Thaiification or Thaiization of the peoples of Thailand. This was actually a movement that sort of looked at integrating the peoples of Thailand as one sort of major peoples have not been able to come to some form of mutual understanding and cooperation. And this has actually really helped the movement, this insurgent sort of Islamist jihadist movement to come in and take root and actually take cause with the local people who earlier used to be rather, relaxed and peaceful in their outlook towards the Thai government. Third, I would look at the Philippines, and I think this is also a very interesting Islamic insurgency within the Philippines since 1969. I'm sure most of you have heard of it, so I won't go into it, but it's the Moro conflict. It's been divided into three parts, and essentially the Moros consider themselves having had a bad deal through history, thanks to a long list of colonialists actually taking over their sense of statism. So essentially, what this did was that it is still an ongoing insurgency in Mindanao, but essentially, it was triggered by the Jabida massacre, which saw the killing of 60 Filipino Muslim commandos on a planned operation to reclaim the eastern part of the Malaysian state of Sabah. Now, in response to this, there was a University of Philippines professor called Nur Misuari who established the Moro National Liberation Front. And this is where the conversation really begins, because this was an armed insurgent group which till date has been committed to establishing an independent Mindanao state. And over the years, of course, the MNLF in itself was splintered into various subsections of, insurgent groups. And those insurgent groups actually went on to, maintaining a ceasefire with the government, except for the MNLF. The MNLF still stand by their decision and want an independent Mindanao state. Of course, again, human rights violations and the number of casualty statistics run into thousands and thousands. And in 2013, there was a Zamboanga city crisis. I'm sorry, I'm not very good with the pronunciations. But this is an ongoing crisis. Essentially, the city of Zamboanga was an armed conflict in the city between the forces of the Republic of the Philippines and a faction of the MNLF. So essentially, throughout these last couple of decades, there has been armed ethnic conflict between the MNLF and its various factions against the government of the Philippines. There has been a lot of displacement again, there has been migration. And even though there has been a ceasefire since 28 September 2013 in the city of Zambonga, there are still lots of skirmishes and violations of the ceasefire that are reported. And finally, in terms of how this has played out currently, it is very interesting to see that after 2002, the war on terrorism, global terrorism under the US-led forces, there was an Operation Enduring Freedom that was struck with between the Philippines and the US to essentially take care of the communist structures and the terrorism structures that were forming in the Southeast Asian region. And this wasn't exactly met with a lot of favor by the existing ethnic parties within Philippines. Essentially, this has now led us to the final discussion on Indonesia, which is also seeing a conflict since 1969 to present-day Indonesia. And this is an ongoing low-level conflict between the Indonesian government and portions of the indigenous populations of West Papua in the provinces of Papua and West Papua. Again, this has a historical context in terms of the fact that the Dutch actually wanted to give them independence because they were not ethnically a part of the Indonesian mainland. However, the Indonesians at the time suggested that they be a part and be allowed a plebiscite at a later date, which is contested. The plebiscite is contested to have been taken at gunpoint and not having had a majority vote at stake, which has meant that the West Papuans have constantly been protesting and raising flags for their independence against the Indonesians on the very basis that they are ethnically very, very different. So, and again, what has happened as a consequence, one thing that you will notice throughout these discussions is the fact that there are a lot of refugees. In fact, there are 13,500 Papuan refugees that live in exile in the neighboring independent state of Papua New Guinea. And I think what I'm going to leave this point at is that there is a lot of links in terms of basic trends that you see in Southeast Asia. Whichever country you look at, as I mentioned at the beginning of this discussion, there is an intrinsic link with history and the fact that there were a lot of unresolved disputes that have now, in a contorted idea of nationalism rather, have actually led to further divides rather than their coming together. And these factions have actually allowed for other issues such as religious fundamentalism to actually come in and thrive upon these differences to strengthen and create their ideologies further. And I think the issue of refugees and forced migration is something that has been a constant issue in Southeast Asia for the ASEAN in terms of its conversations as well. And it is something that needs to be talked about much more and at a macro level, so to say. So that's how I will end my discussion. Thank you.